John 20, the first day of the week, comes Mary Magdalene early. So just that, the first day of the week. No mention that it's the Sabbath, or the end of the Sabbath. Matthew does mention Sabbath in the end of the Sabbath as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week. Still nighttime. Mark 16:2, and very early in the morning, the first day of the week. Luke, now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning. There's a bit that I have to add here, which I saved for now. Earlier in Matthew it says, the graves were opened and many bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the graves after his resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many. It clearly says, Matthew 27:53, after his resurrection. So the exact moment that Jesus is raised matters. And if you look up the ceremonial significance of the first fruits offering during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it is a future telling, a foreshadowing of Jesus rising from the dead. That time is the exact moment of sunset leading into Sunday. The sunset of the Sabbath.
Why is this statement there? It all has to do with the very reason that we always keep the Feast of Passover and unleavened bread in the month of the Aviv barley. Because if you do not do this right, you will never be able to count to 3. And this is the reason that the Pharisees changed the counting of the Omer, and they changed the day of the Bikurim after the destruction of the temple. And so now on the modern Jewish calendar, many times you'll see the Pharisee reckoning and the Zadokim, or the priest of Zadok reckoning, because they know that they changed it. They changed it deliberately so that no one could understand that Yeshua fulfilled this very picture. And this is the picture. When the Passover lambs were sacrificed on the Temple Mount, the last one that was sacrificed was the one that was selected by the high priest. When that lamb was sacrificed, the high priest, after all this work, with all the priests working and singing the psalm together, he would then wet his lips, and then he would make a final proclamation, "It is finished." The lambs were then taken off the Temple Mount and put in the ovens. The high priest and his entourage of priests would take their lambs and take them down into a chamber in the Temple Mount in Mount Moriah and would put them in the ovens in the priest's chamber. Literally in Mount Moriah, the mountain where Yahweh will be our Moreh, or teacher. And then, after they put the lambs in the oven, it's still late in the afternoon, and the high priest will then lead an entourage of priests off the Temple Mount over the Kidron Valley Bridge, where they will then be over the Kidron Valley Bridge on the side of the Mount of Olives, where the priest planted the barley for the first fruit offering. To this very day, the entire side of the Mount of Olives is covered with barley that continues to volunteer year after year, century after century. From when the priest planted it, it's still growing there today. As they were going over the Kidron Valley Bridge, down below them were the graves of the kings and the patriarchs. Over to the right are thousands and thousands of graves over to the right. Today, it's the largest cemetery in the world. The Levites will then bind together 10 standing shocks of barley. They don't cut it. They bind the barley together, still rooted in the ground. They put a cord around it, and they do 10 standing shocks of 1 omer apiece. Then they leave them in that condition, bound together, still standing. They go back across the Kidron Valley Bridge. They go down into Mount Moriah, and there, when the sun sets and the lamb is roasted, they will then eat the Passover lamb with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and the high priest stays in the mountain in seclusion until the end of the weekly Sabbath. And this is what happens at the end of the weekly Sabbath. Listen very carefully. The high priest will then leave the Temple Mount with a large entourage of priests, and several of these priests will have baskets in their hands and sickles in their hands. Just after the sun sets, at the end of the weekly Sabbath, because now we can go back to work when the sun sets at the end of the Sabbath, that is when the entourage of priests goes over the Kidron Valley Bridge, would then cut those standing shocks of barley in the darkness. Remember, it was bound together in the light. Now the sun is set, and they then harvest that barley. They put the barley in their baskets, carry it back across the Kidron Valley Bridge to the Temple Mount, where they then, if the barley is not quite completely dried yet, then they will parch it in fire. They will separate the wheat from the chaff. They will then grind the barley and then make it into loaves and bake it. And in the morning, the high priest will then take those barley loaves into the holy place and wave them before the Holy of Holies as the offering of the bikurim, the first fruits of the barley. That is in Leviticus chapter 23. So, when was Yeshua raised from the dead? This is what the Gospels tell us. When Yeshua knew his hour was come, he said, I thirst. What is this hour that was come? When the last Passover lamb was sacrificed. He then wet his mouth, and he pulled up against those nails and pushed up one last time and filled his lungs with air. And then he made out the cry that the high priest had made at this moment when the last Passover lamb was sacrificed. It is finished. And he bowed his head and he gave up the ghost. And the Gospel of Matthew reads, and the earth quaked, the rocks rent, and the graves of the saints were opened. And when he arose, 3 days and 3 nights later, the saints in the graves arose and appeared to many in the streets of Jerusalem. Wait just a minute. Why is it giving the whole punchline? He just said it is finished. He just died. And then the next statement is, and the earthquake, the graves were open, and when he arose, they arose, is giving us a punchline that he's going to rise 3 days and 3 nights later. Why is this statement there? We're given the punchline all the way in the beginning. Why? Because we are being told that he is fulfilling in every detail now the bikurim of the first fruits. He cried with a loud voice, it is finished. The earthquake, the rocks rent. This is when the high priest was going over with his entourage and binding together the sheaves. The standing omer of barley, the stalks of barley were bound together, and that is when the graves were opened. The first fruits of the dead were being marked. They weren't being cut then. They're just being marked. And they were being marked, and the earth was shaking at the very time that they were binding those standing shocks of barley together. They saw it, the earthquake. They saw those graves open, but nobody came out of them. 3 days and 3 nights later, Yeshua, first of all, gets up on the weekly Sabbath. He is the firstborn from among the dead. Now, when the high priest goes over with his entourage to harvest the barley, that is when Yeshua, who is the high priest after the order of the Melchizedek, That is when he, with the keys of death and the grave, unlocks the grave, and in front of these thousands of Israelites who are there to witness the harvesting of the barley, the first fruits of the barley, they right there in their very presence, that is when Yeshua unlocks the grave, and those saints come out of the grave and appear to many in the streets of Jerusalem. They see it. He, as the high priest, has to be in seclusion until he offers the first fruits before the throne. That morning, he takes the first fruits which he had raised from the dead right after the sun had set, in the presence of all of these Israelites and the priest over on the side of the Mount of Olives. When he raises them from the dead, the next morning he takes the first fruits from the earth, he ascends up before his Father's throne in heaven and presents the first fruits in heaven, does the wave offering, I'll see you in a few days, Father, and he was back down on the earth to intercept two of his hurt and despondent disciples who had slammed the door in Jerusalem, walked out of Jerusalem during the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the way to Emmaus, and he came up behind them as they were having a very morbid conversation. Disguising himself, and said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, what are you so depressed about? What is this, morbid conversation you're having?" And they said, "Are you some kind of stranger around these parts? You've not known the things which have come to pass in these days?" And Yeshua said, "What things? Like he doesn't know?" And so mile after mile, they then rehearsed back to him what had taken place during those days. And Yeshua then asks the questions and draws out every last detail to get them to tell him everything that they saw, everything that had taken place. And finally he stopped and said, "O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Messiah to have suffered all these things you've just enumerated and then enter into his glory?" And beginning at Moses and through all the prophets, he then detailed that the Messiah must do all these things. He then detailed that the Messiah had just fulfilled the spring feast of the Lord to the very day, the very hour, the exact moment, in every detail in which we'd rehearsed these things in the feast of the Lord's at Jerusalem. And it says that Yeshua opened their understanding, and it changed their life forever. Because they then understood that the Messiah came the first time as a suffering servant, that he came to fulfill the spring feast of the Lord, and he'd done it to the very day, the very hour, the exact moment, in every detail in which we'd rehearsed them. He fulfilled the spring feast of the Lord, including the Bikurim, the first fruit offering, because he raised the dead. When he arose, they arose and appeared to many in the streets.
So, that night, there would have to be these people rising from the dead. And not just that, but also, I'm going to put there, Matthew 28. There was a great earthquake, and the angel of the Lord descended from heaven, came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. That earthquake, I think, is associated with Jesus rising. I'm not exactly sure if it happened after or before, or if Jesus just walked through the stone and they moved the stone in order for everyone to see that he was risen, or if the angel had to move it in order for Jesus to walk out. I'm not sure, but I'm going to have them all combined because they're all part of the same event, Jesus rising. And by the time the women arrive, he's already arisen. So I'm not going to save it for later. Yeah, so I'll start right there. Matthew 28:2. And behold, there was a great earthquake. Just Matthew. For the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door. And for fear of him, the keepers did shake and become as dead men. I think what that means is that they just fainted. Now, before the angel actually says to the women anything, because they haven't arrived yet, I'm going to mention from earlier in Matthew now. And many bodies of the saints. Which slept arose and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city and appeared to many.